brought to you in part by Howard Products. Since 1969, Howard Products has made a wide range of polishes and wood finish restorers. Their hit products, such as Restore Finish and Feed and Wax, have been used in the vintage audio industry for decades, enabling vintage audio enthusiasts to keep their equipment looking as good as they sound. If you want to find out more about Howard Products or to take a look at their product range to see what you can use to bring your equipment back to life, check out www.howardproducts.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first series, episodic series of the eCoustics podcast. And this one is all focused on vintage audio. We have two phenomenal eCoustics contributors, vintage columnists, and great people. We have Eric Pye at Audio Love YYC and Jeremy Sikora at Budget Audio Filer, who are going to be hosting and leading this conversation, where throughout this series we will be hearing them and tidbits from me. My name is Mitch Anderson from Black Circle Radio, who will be moderating this series. So thank you for your trust in my ears, fellas. And there will be chats about amplifiers, speakers, reel-to-reels. It goes on and on, and so I'm very excited to have both of you here, and we've been planning this for a while, and the time has come. So, Eric, what would you like to kind of kick things off with here to say to the audience? I mean, welcome.
Well, yeah, looking forward to talking about vintage audio. Looking forward to hopefully getting some people who are not into vintage yet excited about it. And to help people who are already into it to maybe, progress the equipment that they have, what they're listening to, and just enjoy vintage audio.
Jeremy?
Absolutely the same. Just spreading the knowledge about the vintage equipment, how to get into it, what to buy, when to buy, and anything to do with setting up what looks like a complicated system, but it's really not that hard.
And before we begin with today's topic of amplifiers of all sorts of different ways and makes and models and usages of, I think it's very exciting that between the two of you, there's over 100,000 people who are actively interacting with you, who are actively being inspired and becoming curious about sound, even though vintage focused, just to inspire someone's curiosity about sound in general is the goal, right? But to have it be vintage focused and take it that step further is a magical sonic journey, and I'm excited to begin. So Jeremy, how about you take us away in this first episode?
So for the first episode, we'll be talking about receivers, integrated amps, amplifiers, and preamps, and what the differences are. So from a high level, and we'll talk very high level, the receivers, basically the preamp, the amp, and a tuner all built into one. So it has everything you need to make sound, minus speakers and minus inputs other than pulling in an FM station. An integrated amplifier basically says there's a preamp in there, there's an amplifier in there, but there is no tuner. So no inputs built into it. You'll have to get a separate tuner. You can hook a network streamer to it, a record player, whatever you want.
The early 50s, when recording technology took off and microphone technology took off. But in those days, all of the equipment was based on tubes. Mm-hmm. And all of it was mono pretty much until the mid 50s, where you started to get some stereo recordings. You started to get some, stereo records. You started to get turntables that could play stereo, those kinds of things. A lot of the amplifiers were still mono. So what they would do is they would pair a couple of amplifiers together to get a stereo effect out of it. Mm. Things developed slowly as people, perhaps didn't have enough space for two mono amplifiers. They started making stereo tube amplifiers. And those were kind of like the bread and butter. You had, tube amplifiers, tube receivers through the 60s until the late 60s, where solid state came in. And so you were able to make things smaller. You were able to make things more powerful. You were able to make things that weren't going to possibly catch fire because tubes get very, very hot.
Victory.
And so, yeah, around about 68, 69 is where you start to see the shift away from tubes and into solid state. And so certainly the era of the 70s, that was the era where, you started getting more and more power. You had the receiver wars that were quite famous. You started to get, that's where, the big Marantz and the big Pioneers and the big Techniques and all the other brands started coming in. And, I think probably the 70s was kind of the heyday of audio and power audio in particular. And then things started to kind of like fall off in the mid 80s when the economy tanked and the audio companies started focusing on costs, and things started to look a bit cheaper and sound a bit cheaper and so on and so forth. So I'm not really sure where I'm going with that in terms of what your original question was, but those are kinds of things that Jeremy and I are playing around with. But yeah, when you go back to that versatility thing, the tubes sound quite different than most solid state. And so if you want to start playing with tubes, this is where you can get a tube amplifier where you don't have to worry too much about the power. And you can pair a tube preamp, pair it with a solid state power amp to run a powerful pair of speakers, but still get that really nice classic 50s and 60s tube sound. I stupidly went the other way. I have a tube power amp with solid state preamps or integrated amps that have pre functions. But the limitations that I have there with that Dynaco are that I can't really run super power hungry speakers because it's only 35 watts a channel. If I'm running them through Klipsch or something that's very efficient, my ESS sounds fantastic. But as soon as I want to use the more powerful speakers, then I'm switching to solid state, just because otherwise I don't enjoy the sound that much.
And so, and for any musicians that are listening right now as well, about that era with your you're talking about the tube preamp with the solid state power section. You can think like Music Man amplifiers. Like those are very known, and we're right in line with that era of that transition from tube to solid state that the hi-fi world saw too, which I think is really neat. It wasn't just the home audio and consumer or pro grade. It was both. It was consumer grade and professional grade amplification that was going through that transition together. And so like to be able to combine them in that way is super neat, because truth be told, I've never done that before. Taken one of my amps and just run a preamp out. And that is also really kind of cool. It's got my wheels spinning a little bit, because if there's an amp that goes down, right? Like it's like, oh man, like something happened to my output section. The amplifier is not necessarily useless, right? Like,
yeah. Yeah. So for example, I have a Sansui right now that has a bit of a temperamental power stage. It happens to be an integrated amp that has a very good pre-section, and so I often will pair that with the an external power amp, so that way I don't have to worry about the fact that I've got this crackle in the power stage because I'm bypassing it. At some point, I will take it in to be repaired, but for now, I don't have to. I can live with it, and I can still use it and still enjoy it.
Jeremy, what are some of the main questions that you see and that you get from that people hit you up with at Budget Audiofiler, like specifically about amplifiers? I mean, what's kind of the main baseline or interest or problems that people are running into that are reaching out for?
Absolutely. I would say the main one is how much wattage do I need? What inputs do I need, and how can I make my record player work? So let's go through all of them kind of backwards.
Yeah, sure.
So let's talk about inputs first. When you're looking for a receiver or an integrated amp or a preamp, you're going to want most likely at least one aux input preferably two, but one is fine. You'll want one sort of tape input. A lot of them have two. You don't really need to. There's not a lot of people running two different tape sources anymore. And importantly, because in the 80s and the 90s, this started to fade away, you actually want a phono input, because there's a lot of receivers out there that they phased it out when they thought vinyl was dead. So that also doesn't mean that you can't run a record player, but you'll have to have an external phono preamp, and we'll get into those when we talk about the record players. But main thing is inputs. I kind of steer people towards models that do have the preamp out, because then when they pair it with their speakers, if they need a different sort of amplification, they have that flexibility. So it's basically flexibility when it comes to that preamp out. Wattage wise, you can do a lot with 30 watts, but I would say anything between 30 and 80, you're going to be just fine. There's a lot of people out there that are like, I need 120 amps. I'm like, no, well, 120 watts. You don't need 120 watts unless you want to let the neighbors know something. So you can shake your own walls at 30, 40 watts. So that's not really needed.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are I mean, the nice thing about more powerful power amps is that they will give a certain amount of authority into a pair of speakers, and so you may end up with a bit fuller sound even if you don't turn it up to 11. But yeah, I agree. I think for me the sweet spot is kind of 50 watts. If you get a 50 watt amplifier, that'll drive pretty much anything with an enjoyable sound coming out of with most speakers.
So is that 50 watts? Is that 50 watts tube or 50 watts solid state, or either?
Yeah,
I would say
that's cool. Okay, yeah.
I would say either. Now there are some people that say, quote, tube watts go farther. There's probably some truth to that. But I do want to touch on something that Eric said. Can you have a 100-watt system on 30-watt speakers? The answer is yes, but you can't turn it all the way up. So if you are careful with your volume, because a lot of people kind of think, I can't run this with this set of speakers. This is a vintage set of speakers and it runs at 60 watts. Not the end of the world. Converse to that, you can have an underpowered amp and then hook it to speakers, and the speakers will possibly be damaged. So it may do something called clipping, and you'll know exactly what that sounds like the first time you do it.
Yeah.
So we've talked about so far, everybody. We've talked about inputs. We've talked a lot about preamp outs, which I think might have been stemmed by me a little bit, but I'm not going to apologize for it at all. And so that was some really cool information and educational. One thing I do wonder is when either of you are deciding, or even in your past have decided, about making a change in your system, an upgrade, or maybe a curiosity-inspired risk, when it comes to changing out amplification, what are your red flags? Like, gosh, I wish it didn't have this wrong with it, or I would definitely do it, or man, this is a smoking deal. And how do you feel like that? Eric, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think this is one where Jeremy and I are very different, in that Jeremy can fix stuff himself, and I can't. So I'm typically looking for something that has been serviced recently. And so a lot of my questioning will be around, how recently was it serviced? Was it fully recapped? Was it partly recapped? Those kinds of things, looking at how old the equipment is and kind of doing math in my head to kind of figure out, once you get to that 30, 40 years age kind of thing, it's like, well, if it hasn't been recapped, then I'm going to have to factor that into the price of whatever I'm paying, because I'll be taking it in to be recapped. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then a lot of it is looking at how is this going to what synergy am I going to have with the speakers that I have? I know I have some speakers that are quite efficient, and I have some speakers that are not so efficient. And so, I may be looking at one point, I might be looking for something with power for the power hungry speakers, and other times something else. I look for what physical, like what does it look like? Is it pretty? Is it all scratched up? Has it been beat to hell? I tend to go for stuff that is aesthetically pretty much 100%. Just because that fits my vibe, and because if it's good on the outside, more often than not, it's been cared for on the inside too. But yeah, those are some of the things that I look for. Jeremy, how about yourself?
Yeah, I would echo absolutely both of those. When it comes down to pieces that I purchase now, I make sure all of the knobs are there, that it's all present, because some of the parts you're just not going to find. And I've gone down that rabbit hole a few times, and I don't recommend it. So I also bring in budget into it, because per Eric's point, you can get a fully restored 1960 Fisher if you want. They're out there. You're going to pay for it, but they're out there. And you can also get one that literally is covered in dust, and you have no idea whether or not it powers on, but it's for 1/10 of the cost. So with some rudimentary testing safely, you can bring that back to life. And then for the areas that I'm not comfortable with, like transformers or something hardcore like that, there's people out there that will help gladly. So when it comes down to what I'm looking for, it's is this a large purchase? Is this a small one? Pairing with the speakers is absolutely paramount. So if you have a set of speakers, then you're going to want to make sure that you kind of match preferred wattages with that. If you're going to get this receiver and then you're going to buy speakers afterwards, a little bit more flexible there. But I do highly recommend getting something that is complete. If you have history on it, makes it even better. But there's all kinds of stuff to look for. There's just the font even. I know people that have bought Macintosh gear just because of the green. I know people that buy Marantz because of the cool different fonts that it has on the faceplate. So that's certainly a part of this, but it's you want to make sure that it has the functionality that you want, that it's in a level of either restoration or disrepair that you're comfortable with. I mean, I purchased receivers that don't work and then only use them as a preamp because the output never got fixed.
Right.
So if you're comfortable with that, there's options, but stick with a functioning receiver, and that is by far the best place to start.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, and that is, like, if you have a budget, stick to the budget, because you can get a nice set that's going to fit your budget. Don't be like dazzled by the lights or by the fancy name, or it has to be a Marantz. I have a friend who came over last weekend, and we were listening to my Macintosh system, and he was blown away by it. And he's now dead set on, I'm going to buy a stereo, and it has to be Macintosh because nothing else will do. Now I've told him it's going to be expensive, and he's like, oh, I don't care. But I'm going to have him come over at some point very soon before he buys a Macintosh and say, let's listen to a different system that I have. And without comparing directly to the Macintosh, can you actually tell me if it's better? And I think one of the joys that I've had has been, I've been in this for years and years and years, and I finally got a Mac last year. And I can appreciate the Mac because I've gone through a bunch of cheaper systems that all sounded great to me, but as I improved piece by piece by piece, incrementally it got better, and I can now appreciate where I've gotten to with the systems that I have, because of that history that I have with other equipment.
Some of the brands that come to my mind about like the budget side of things, where you can really score a really great sound, kind of under the radar. I think some of the old Kenwood stuff really smokes. I also think that there's some really neat old Sony stuff. And Onkyo, I've seen some pretty cool and heard some pretty cool vintage stuff as well. Are there other brands that you guys that are kind of in that, like, under the radar type sound that you're digging on?
Jeremy, just so you're aware, I'm playing brand bingo here, and I know what you're going to say, but how about receivers, Jeremy?
Receivers, I'm a Harman Kardon Twin Power, which is the 430, the 730, and there's a few other ones out there. But anything to do with Twin Power, those are really, really well made, and they fly under the radar screen a little bit. Also, I'm an absolutely massive fan of the Advent Model 300.
Oh yeah,
it can be found anywhere between $50 and $200, and it has an incredible phono stage. It has all the inputs you need, and you can use it as a full standalone or as a preamp, and most people use it as a preamp.
And did I see a JVC pop up recently?
Yes. Yeah. I am a fan of JVC, all the way up until the 80s even. So, JVCs, great little units, and can be found anywhere between, $20 and $100 even. So that's a great place to start.
Another tell to going back to what to look out for when buying, if the power cord has been cut, there's a pretty good strong visual right there of red flag. Kind of maybe want to stay away from this one, because I've purchased stuff. I have a Pentron preamp that I need to have fixed for some studio use, and I bought it with the cable cut. And the tech was like, yeah, most of the time when you're seeing a piece of equipment with the cable cut, that's the main transformer's fried. It's kind of like, he said, kind of a tech thing. Not all techs do it, but if you see a huge, like, if you see a nice amp with no cable, yeah, it's probably a transformer. So that, just wanted to bring that one up too. Yeah, I think that we've covered quite a bit in this first episode of this Vintage Focus series. We're going to have quite a few more coming down the pipe, and we will, kind of just see where it takes us all. Guys, are there any final sound waves you want to share before we wrap?
No, I think we've covered it all.
I would add Kyocera to that list too.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to throw a brand out there, I would throw out Sansui. Sansui's prices have gone crazy recently, but I absolutely love the brand. I have 4 of their integrated amps now. Just got a new one last weekend, and I will happily buy others as well. That's something that was an aspirational thing for me, as opposed to something to start out with, I think.
And then I bought one because Eric had one. So it is, there is something to be said about when I talk to Eric and Eric's like, yeah, I really like that. And then you can find something similar. So that is another buying tip, is look at what other people are running on their main system, and then talk to them. Say, how do you like it? Would you recommend it?
And mind the era. I guess I did say we were going to wrap, but the era does matter with a lot of this stuff, where a lot of these manufacturers, their name was bought out by a larger, corporation somewhere down the line. And even though the name is the same, a lot of times the build quality is not, and the only thing that is still existent of once a powerful amplifier is the name. So with some of this stuff, just be mindful as you get into the 80s of kind of what you're looking at. So just wanted to throw that tidbit in too. But thank you everybody for listening to this episode. Thank you, Eric at Audio Love YYC, Jeremy Sikora at Budget Audio Filer, and team at eCoustics. Thank you very much. I've been your host this episode, Mitch Anderson of Black Circle Radio. remember to hit subscribe, and we will see you next time.